Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Crucial Talks podcast. I am your host, Mike Sedam. If you get a chance, I'd really appreciate it if you could please subscribe to the podcast and review it. It helps a lot with people trying to find the podcast. Now, on this episode, we're going to do something just a bit different, and it's something I want to start doing more of, and that is talking to practitioners, people that are actually out there every day doing some of the things we talk about here on the Crucial Talks podcast. So if you think you want to talk to me about what you're doing and what your organization is doing, please visit www.crucialtalks.com and reach out to me on email, LinkedIn, Twitter, or Facebook. I'd love to connect with you and maybe even interview you for a future episode. So without further ado, let's get into this episode. Today's guest is Jason Weber. He is the Director of Training and Development for the state of Wisconsin. And in that role, he's really helping bring a bunch of different agencies under one umbrella and using a shared service model for their HR functions. So basically, in layman's terms, he's bringing a bunch of people together and trying to do a certain function with all those different agencies, all those different cultures, all those different policies and procedures. So today, I'd like to welcome Jason Weber to the Crucial Talks podcast. How are you doing today, Jason?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thanks for having me.
I think it's going to be a fun conversation to have. A lot of people don't think HR is fun, but what I want to get across is the fact that it's not just the HR tactics we're talking about here. It really is a lot of the stuff we've talked about on the Crucial Talks podcast with behavior and how human beings think and how people react. But before we get into all of that and everything you're doing with the state of Wisconsin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you ended up where you are right now?
Sure. So, my professional career, I like to say, has taken one of those unique journeys. I actually started my professional career in law enforcement, working in both Missouri and Minnesota. And I had the opportunity then to move into higher education. And that's really when I got my first grab at professional development or teaching. And after spending a few years doing that, I had an opportunity to come over to the state of Wisconsin, originally with the Department of Corrections as a staff development trainer. Now, the Wisconsin Department of Corrections is our largest state agency. We've got a little over 10,000 employees in that agency. And as a part of the training center, myself and another one of my coworkers, we spent really the majority of our time working with teams across the state, whether it's in institutions, probation and parole, HR, financial, all these different units. And the focus that we really honed in on was team effectiveness. How do we work effectively together? Because we were seeing, the criminal justice field, just in general, morale can be difficult to come by. And it was the same way in corrections. And so we were trying to identify ways that we could really fix it, try to have that optimistic viewpoint of how we can fix it. So from that, we had created a new training series, something they had never done before, where we really flipped the script on development training. And we removed technology, turned our trainings into 2-hour training blast, and then supplemented them with, half-day, full-day trainings. And we wanted to give them something different. One, to bring some energy back to training, but two, to really focus on that human element. Very, very often in organizations, both public and private sector, one of the things that I see lacking is that, we're constantly going through so much change that we forget about that human element. We forget about, we need to take care of those basic needs of our staff. And so that's what we really wanted to create. So we spent a few years kind of playing with that, building different courses. And then I was fortunate enough to move over to the Department of Transportation as their training director. And that was an organization where when I came aboard, we had a brand new administration. And so there was a significant amount of change. And so I spent a lot of time, again, working with executive leadership and also staff on how do we work through change? Like, we can talk about all these models, we can talk about all these, theories, but I mean, how we do it, that's really the big question. And then in July of this year, 2018, we received word that we were going to be moving into a shared services model for the state of Wisconsin. And basically, we had 15 key agencies that were a part of the shared services team. And then we had 6 non-shared services. So like our Department of Justice, Public Instruction, agencies like that were not technically a part of it. But I was asked to move into the enterprise training director role to kind of lead this function. And really what that meant was, it was kind of a welcome to your job, figure out your org chart and go. And so it was really starting from scratch to build the team that I have now, working with all of these agencies. And, over the last 10 months, it's been such an amazing learning experience in regards to dealing with perspective and how people view training. What's important to one may not be important to another. And then, the mindsets and the paradigm shifts. I'm asking all of the staff to go from, serving one single agency to, having a more of a global perspective in regards to you're not just serving one audience, you're now serving, over 30,000 employees. And how do we do that? And so, like I said, the last 10 months has been a lot of challenges, a lot of opportunity, a lot of growth. But that's been, it's just been an amazing experience. It's allowed me to, just kind of on the side, I'm finishing my doctorate in leadership development, specifically looking at servant leadership and how that can apply to team effectiveness. But a lot of great, kind of case studies that I'm living and, learning as we go through. So, that's just a little bit about, my background and how I got to where I am today.
Well, great. And I love a lot of what you said, especially what you're doing now. I mean, you're going for your doctorate. You've been working in the field doing this stuff. And my thesis advisors always said it, and I kind of stole in their terminology, but they called it a pracademic, practicing academic, which is pretty cool. So what I loved about what you said is you are talking about taking this optimistic viewpoint that you've did throughout your history, throughout your career. You've had to deal with change and kind of use this optimistic viewpoint to kind of look forward and figure out what you need to do. I love that because one of the things we talk about here on the podcast all the time is appreciative inquiry, which is actually a strength-based positive approach to human-based systems, which is exactly what you're doing. And the other thing I loved about what you said and what you're doing now, because I know we're going to shift into what you're actually accomplishing right now that you've been dealing with this year, but you said it's an enterprise model. And before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, what do you mean by enterprise? Because the way I look at it, when somebody's talking about an enterprise level, like a lot of times I hear it when they're trying to bring technology into a company. And the enterprise level is really about taking something and putting it into practice across a bunch of different disciplines. Is that kind of what you're talking about when you talked about enterprise training and development?
It is to a point. We've been over the last couple of years, we've been leveraging this, this enterprise terminology. We recently moved to a new system for our, finance, our payroll, and now our learning environments. And that was taking what was 74 different systems and then merging them into one. And so that was kind of the initial enterprise kind of definition or application on how we used it. And now, as we go into the training model, because each of these agencies are so different, what we're doing is instead of creating training that may only impact a small number of learners, we're now creating training that can impact again, everyone as a whole. And, how we do that is we've got a very clear definition of what our team's responsibility is. And as much as I say it's clear, it's also intentionally vague. So for example, the key things that we focus on are new employee orientation, new supervisor development. We have an enterprise managers development academy. We also have an HR certification training program. And then the last two were titled very intentionally, which is staff development training and then leader development training. And the reason I did that is because knowing that all of these agencies were different, the one thing I didn't want to do is I didn't want to lock ourselves into a certain type of training. I wanted us to be flexible and adaptable to the needs. And by, approaching it through that lens, that gives us a lot of freedom when we're designing and developing, this enterprise approach.
Well, and so you're talking a lot about not only different types of training, but really hitting a bunch of different levels of people, from brand new employees to people that may have been in the workplace for could be decades, right? So you're trying to develop these programs and these trainings that really have to hit a bunch of different people. Is that what I'm hearing from you?
Yeah, that's correct. One of the big tasks that we've been working on, and one of the big discussion points, at least in the training world, has been how do we fill in those gaps? Because in my experience of looking at training programs, it's kind of the standard. You've got a new employee orientation, welcome aboard. Here's the basics you want to know. Now go and do great things. And then you promote. All right, here's what we expect of you as a supervisor. Now go and do great things. And it's not uncommon for us to have staff, at least in the state of Wisconsin, where we would have staff that went through a new employee orientation or maybe a new soup training like 20 years ago and haven't had anything since. And so as I've defined the staff and leader development, it's really with that intention to fill in those gaps. So all right, we can now build consistency and progression. So if I've got a staff member who has been around 10, 15 years, instead of just saying, well, they know what they're doing, let's give them new development opportunities. And, let's help kind of shift how they're seeing things. I mean, there's a lot of elements that go into that, with the multi-generational workforces and just overall different perspectives of dealing with new technology and just how to interact with people. So I would really define it as the leader and the staff and leader development are really designed to help us fill in those gaps between kind of the intro.
You make a really interesting point, because I think in a lot of organizations, not just government organizations, but even private industry, there's a lot of issues with that same thing. Like, you get initial training, but then there's nothing that really keeps you kind of going, right? Keeps you engaged and keeps you learning. And I think that's where a lot of organizations may fail, or at least may not be recognizing where they can see a lot of benefit, because it seems like one of the first things to go when people want to cut budgets or anything like that is always training. But that training has such a high return on investment that it sounds like what you're trying to do is fill in those really could be long gaps where people get no training at all.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the key things that I see on a regular basis is this. It really kind of goes back to this notion of empowerment, where staff will put a lot on their supervisors, or basically they will react or respond based on how their supervisor leads or does not lead. And a lot of the trainings that we've designed and developed and that we deliver on a regular basis really touch on that, that self ownership of being able to look at your work through this lens of control. You have the ability to control how you interact, how you respond, how you deal with conflict, all of that. You have control over that. And when we talk about kind of getting that resistance of, well, but my supervisor doesn't let me do this or doesn't do that. Well, okay, but if we talk about influence, right? If we talk about curiosity, emotional intelligence, skills like that, where we can help kind of empower and further define the influence that our staff can have in their day-to-day roles. To me, that's a big win because again, we're finding ways to give our staff the that power and that ability and the insight to be able to kind of take the work that they do and run with it.
Well, I love what you're doing, because it sounds like what you're doing, and I talk about this and I say this word all the time, but it's building capacity. It's not just the, hey, these are the policies, these are procedures, these are the steps and the forms you need to fill out and blah, blah, blah. It's more, you're building the capacity for employees to be empowered in the workplace so that you can actually improve performance in that way.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly it. Yep.
Well, that's great. And I'm just going to put a quick plug in here for another episode. But if anybody's interested in what we're talking about with regard to kind of like shots of performance training, right, to keep people's abilities honed and to keep them sharp, if you want to look at episode 55 with Isaac Tolpin, we actually talked about microlearning and how he is bringing that into the workplace. And we talked a little bit about that, but really talked about the theory behind it on why human beings can perform at a higher level with these little shots of training. So if you want a little more info on that, go ahead and check out episode 55. So Jason, when you moved into your current position, it doesn't sound like it didn't sound like you could really bring anything with you. It's not like you promoted within an organization. This was like a new thing, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that and the challenges you faced?
Yeah. So as we, once it was decided that shared services was going to go live, there was going to be an expansion of the division of personnel management, and that encompassed everything. And enterprise training was, again, it was brand new. They had individuals who had done training, but those roles weren't clearly defined. And it really was coming from, an established position at one agency where, as a director, I had a team. We knew what we were doing. We were established to what is this going to look like? I remember when I first started, when I was talking with my administration about, the structure. What are we going to look like? We had talked about. They're like, well, we kind of envision you having a team of classroom trainers and instructional designers, kind of like these e-learning developers. And I'm like, okay. And they're like, yeah, that's what we got. And so I'm like, all right, well, do I have the ability here to change this and design and develop it the way I see, that will prove to be effective? And they're like, absolutely. And so over the last 10 months, has really been sharing this message of, from my team, the one thing that I don't want to do is I don't want to lock them into one role. And so over the last, since this has been developing and building, I've got instructional designers that are, tremendous classroom trainers. And I've got classroom trainers that are tremendous, instructional designers. And so it's been, one of the things I know that you and I had talked about just on email was, kind of getting that buy-in. And this is one of the ways that I wanted to really emphasize is one of the concerns that was present as the feedback I was getting was, oh, great, we're going to go into this enterprise. I'm going to be locked into one role and, it's just not going to work. And so right out of the gate, it was really approaching those conversations as, we need an all hands on deck. This is brand new. There's going to be a lot of unknown that we need to be able to figure out. And because of that, we need to be able to adapt. We need to be flexible. We need to be innovative on the spot, really, as we're going with it. And so that's, kind of the development of my team. But then we've got the development of agencies. So, the first 6 months, it was just me before I was able to get the rest of the team on board. And before they were transferred over under me, it was just me. And so it really was me basically like a salesman. I'm going out to the agencies. Here's who I am. Here's my background. Here's what I can bring to you. And, I had my own training catalog and went out, was just doing presentation after presentation to get buy-in. And it was building those relationships. It was, building that trust between, I guess I'll use the word parent, agency, the Department of Administration. There wasn't necessarily a positive perspective about that agency, but it was going out and saying, listen, this is what we're here to do. We're here to support you, and starting those relationships to get buy-in. And, when I look back on, and I'm only 10 months into it, but when I look back on, where the start, I'm actually very thankful that I had that opportunity to be a one-man show for a little bit, just so I could get out there, start building those relationships. And that really helped me define and craft what is now today, this enterprise training and development.
Even though you're in training and development, you're in the state of Wisconsin, you're dealing with government agencies, I want the listeners to kind of push all that aside, because what you're talking about is something that organizations deal with all the time. Salespeople deal with all the time. Engineers deal with all the time. I mean, it really does come down to where we see a lot of failures or a lot of speed bumps in the road in everything we do in these human-based systems, and that's really the relationships. So I love what you're talking about in that you really recognize you had to build trust, that you had to show people and tell people that you were there to support them, and that you started building relationships to get buy-in. That sounds very much like a plan for success in really any organization. It doesn't really matter what your focus is. I don't care if you're selling shoes or if you're trying to start a new training and development agency. It really does seem like the keys have always been trust, getting people to understand what you're trying to do, the bigger picture, and really those relationships. So, in your experience, what you were having to deal with this year, what are some of the challenges you faced when you were trying to do those things? What were people, I mean, were people on board right away, or did you run up against any roadblocks?
Yeah, so it was this part of it was such a learning experience because, in my mind, and I think we all do this, in my mind, I envisioned it going one way. I'd been around the state, for 4 years beforehand, so I knew a lot of people, and I really just kind of went into it going, oh, we'll be good. We're going to have a different type of conversation now, but I've got good relationships. We'll be good. And I was actually really taken back when I was getting resistance out of the gate. I mean, I had some individuals that, said, you're a part of DOA now. We want nothing to do with that. And, yeah, and just because of historical experiences, these past experience they had that for whatever reason weren't positive. I had, some that my favorite one to date, and I will, kind of preface this with, we have a really good relationship now, but, the one, my one favorite right out of the gate was one individual came back and said, anything you do here, we will sabotage. And it was just, again, it just really caught me off guard. Now, those are just two examples, but they really shook me. And, as a new leader of what I was hoping to develop, it really kind of set me back. Now, most of the agencies on board, they didn't have necessarily a formalized training and development team program. So it was really beneficial, very insightful to be able to say, here's who I am. This is what I can bring to your agency. Would love the opportunity just to, maybe come in for a team meeting. Let's start small. Let's get that buy-in and develop from there. But overall, most people were supportive of it. They were willing to give it a go. And we've seen a lot of success. Now, do we still have some agencies that don't want to play nice in the sandbox? Yeah. Are they going to change anytime soon? I don't know. That's something that we're going to keep working on. But overall, it was positive. There's still a lot of uncertainty in regards to, well, what does this mean and what does that mean? But we're working through it, and we're defining them as we go through them.
Did you find that the ones that kind of pushed back, did they already have their own training units or offices?
Yes, those two did. So, in a way, it made sense because there was very much this perspective of, we've had our team for so many years. We really like them, and we're not going to let somebody else come in because we think our training is the best. And, I joke around with people and say, oh yeah, they think their training is the best. And it's, I say that again jokingly, but at the same time, it also carries a lot of weight. There's a lot of what I'm also asking to do is not just build, that relationship and trust and all those elements that go into that. But what I'm asking them to do is kind of to shift their thinking and be open to another perspective, another way of training. Because the training that I had mentioned that we had developed at the Department of Corrections was very different. Many of these agencies were very accustomed to this sit and get type of an approach where, you got the presenter up there, they talk for an hour and then people leave. And the approach that I've, gone to training with is the training's not for me. It's for the learners. So I don't want to be the one doing the most talking. Let's introduce a topic and then let's talk about how you apply it. How do you, how could this work, in the work that you do? And that's a big shift when you go in and say, no, I don't have a PowerPoint for this training because it's all activity based and scenario driven, very facilitative in nature. And when they hear that, they don't know, they don't understand, they haven't seen it. So, we can't really blame them for it. But I think that's where a lot of the resistance comes in, because again, it's a pretty significant shift of how training is developed and then also delivered.
Well, and what you're saying kind of goes in line with some of the things I've talked about here on the podcast, which is a notion of social identity. Really, it comes down to we have all these different roles we play, all these different identities that make up who we are. And when those identities get threatened and we create this in-group and out-group perspective, that's where you get a lot of conflict. And it sounds like the places you had conflict with, or the agency had conflict with, that kind of happened. Like their training and development units or offices felt threatened. And it almost seems like because you guys were now being established and coming in, it threatened their identity. But it sounds like through communication, through building relationships, and through creating kind of this new perspective, new viewpoint for them to look through, a new lens for them to put on, you were able to try to at least start bridging that gap. Did you learn anything, lessons or anything about using viewpoints or changing perspectives and changing perceptions that could help us that are listening to you maybe deal with some of the conflicts we have to face in our own organizations?
Yeah, and I think what it comes down to is, I spend a lot of time talking about, just how we view things in our perspectives. But at the same time, I think one of the things that we have to be careful of is that we're not so locked into our own perspectives, right? If we're spending time trying to change other people's perspectives. So for example, I go to this agency and say, hey, we've got this new training. Now that we're a part of the enterprise, we're going to be able to support you and continue developing training. And they say no. And then my role becomes, well, I need to try and influence. I need to find my way in to help doing, in helping them change that perspective. But one of the things that I learned is I was seeing it through my own experiences. I was seeing these changes. I'm building this program off of the success that I had. And so that's my viewpoint. And one of the things that I learned is I needed to know when to slow down and let them have their way for a bit, right? Let them be able to fully show what that perspective is, because I would tend to get a little too fast. And I would say, nope, this is a perspective, this is how we're going to do it. They're going to love it. It's going to be great. Let's go. And what I didn't do is I didn't slow down enough to fully understand what they were saying. And once that realization came in that, again, there's more than one way of doing things. But once I'm able to remind myself and acknowledge and just understand that I need to be more open to their perspective as well, and truly understanding. Once I was able to do that, I was able to find far greater success with these teams than going in saying, here's what I want to do. They say no. I leave going, I'll get them eventually. And, well, they obviously don't get it. Well, maybe they do. And maybe I don't get it, right? Because I'm not seeing it through the lens in which they're looking at it. So for me, that is a lesson that I continue to remind myself on, something that I check myself on a regular basis, and ensuring that I really understand their perspective before I move forward with, trying to influence or really share mine.
Yeah, and I think you hit a lot of really good points there. I love what you said, because one of the things that we talk about a lot is being self-aware and how we transform ourselves. But it really also comes down to the fact that you have recognized that it's not just tactics you can use to bring people along, but it's also self-awareness. And I really love what you said, that you learned that you could at times slow down and let them have their way for a bit. And what I like about that is the fact that you're now recognizing in yourself things you can change about yourself, new behaviors you want to bring in. And you're basically, by doing that, by being self-aware, by putting on a different lens and having empathy for others within yourself, you're changing from this kind of push mentality to more of a pull. Like they're kind of coming along, as opposed to you try to force them into a box they're not ready to go into yet.
Exactly. And one of the dynamics that we had that came in about 6 months into it was I finally hired on two supervisors that would be directly interacting with these agencies. And I know there's a lot of different approaches and a lot of different mindsets about onboarding new managers and developing them. And with the experience that we're going through now, yeah, I told both of them right on their first day, because after they were done with me, as we were talking about kind of the vision and setting up the goals that we wanted to accomplish, I said, now the one thing that I feel is the most important, the one thing I want you to focus on is relationships. I want you to take time, get to know your staff, but also get to know the agencies. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of uncertainty. And the one thing that we can't afford to miss is the establishment of those relationships. Because if we come in like a bull in a china shop and just say, here's what we're doing, here's where it goes, and we haven't established those relationships, then we're not going to win. We're not going to find success. And that has already shown, it has paid off drastically for us, because as you were saying there, instead of us coming in and pushing, we've been able to partner. We've been able to say,